Welcome to the Law School Toolbox Podcast. Today, we're talking about one of the keys to success in law school, which is managing distractions. Your Law School Toolbox hosts are Alison Monahan, that's me, and Lee Burgess. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so that you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. Together, we're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the Catapult Career Conference. I also run the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review or rating. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can always reach us via the contact forum on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we would love to hear from you. With that, let's get started.
Welcome back. Today we're talking about one of the keys to success in law school, managing distractions. So first off, let's talk about some of the most common distractions students struggle with in law school. So, Alison, what do you think is one of the top distractions for law students, and probably you and I as well?
And probably everyone existing on the planet. Well, I think we've got to face it. You know, we've created this monster of the internet and our phones and social media and all of these things. And these are really huge distractions, I think, for pretty much anyone who is using any of them, because they actually rewire our brains. Mm-hmm. I'm sure you've read these. They make it harder to focus. And a lot of these apps and things, particularly with these push notifications, they're actually designed to activate the reward center in your brain. So it's not really an exaggeration to say they're addictive. They're literally addictive.
Yeah, not to mention the fact that now they're having the studies that say, like, the more you check Facebook, the more depressed you get, which I always think is really interesting.
Right. And I think that's something we want to touch on later is you've got to really be cognizant of what is it doing to you. Mm-hmm. Are you getting something valuable out of the time that you're spending, reading these push notifications from Facebook, or even, at this point, honestly, it's from news sources. I've actually turned off basically all of the push notifications on my phone.
Me too.
Because I'm not sure I want to hear, the latest breaking news from the New York Times or Wall Street Journal multiple times a day. So, because you can't not look at it.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of information fatigue that comes with that. And I think our phones and the connectivity from our phones can be really distracting, but also just being connected to the internet when you're trying to work. I think anytime I've tried to put up any blocker to stop myself from checking Facebook, checking the New York Times, checking People Magazine, whatever it is that I am deciding to waste my time doing, checking Twitter, it's amazing. You don't even realize how fast you go to check those things without even making a conscious decision to do so.
Yeah, at various points, I'm sure we've all done this. I've removed certain apps from my phone so that I did have to make a more conscious choice that if I wanted to go on Facebook, I was going to at least have to go through the second step of, opening up a browser on my phone. I think at one point I even logged myself out all the time. So I'd have to log in. But they try to make it frictionless so that there isn't this friction of you really making a conscious decision. Okay, I'm going to spend 20 minutes doing, checking up on my friends and family and whatever on Facebook or Instagram or Snapchat, whatever you want to be using. That's one thing, but using them all day long, constantly at all times, and having that constantly divided attention makes it really difficult to get substantive thinking done. And, the reality is in law school, you have to do that hard work. And it's really, it's really difficult if you're constantly being distracted.
I think that's totally true. And I know for me personally, I think I've talked about this in another podcast episode. I have an app that runs in the back of my phone that tells me how many hours that I've used my phone. And I think it's called the Moment app. We'll link to it in the show notes. It's very interesting because it not only tracks how many times you pick up your phone, but how many hours that you're on your phone. I think you can upgrade to a pro feature where it even tells you where you're spending your time on your phone, although I think I pretty much know the answer to that. But it has been fascinating to notice the days that I don't spend a lot of time on it, plus the days that I do. And now I actually have notifications that when I hit a certain time limit, I get notifications every 15 minutes after that to note
it's
how
like,
long I've been on my phone.
Get off the phone.
Basically,
get off the phone.
It's totally like, it's like, put down the phone, stop. It's kind of like having somebody nag me on my phone, which is kind of ironic, I guess. But it has made me a little bit more aware and mindful about it. And sometimes, especially at the end of the day when you're tired, which is, I think, when you can really go down the rabbit hole of the distraction on the phone, it does remind me to just say, like, hey, instead of even multitasking and like reading on my phone while watching TV, just like lay it down, like move it out of the room. Like, come on. You're in your house with most of your important people. Like, you don't need to, we don't need to constantly continue reading about stuff outside of what's happening in your own like small world.
Yeah, for sure. The like right before bedtime can be brutal for me. I'll find it like 2 hours have passed and I was just like, what just happened? Or even sometimes with my battery, that's always my clear sign. If my battery suddenly, it's only like 1 PM and I have 30% battery life. And I'm like, wow, where did all that battery life go? And if you look at it, it tells you really clearly what you've been doing for the last 24 hours on your phone. And it's usually not pretty.
Yeah. So anything that you can do to, I think, just become more aware of how you're spending your time on your devices, I think can be helpful, because so often we get into these habits and we're not even making judgment calls about it. So I think internet, phones, and social media, huge time wasters and distractors. Huge.
Yeah. And, people have to be gentle with yourselves about this, because it's not entirely your fault. Mm-hmm. You didn't create these programs. You didn't create these incentives, and other people do sort of expect you to be constantly available these days. And I think a lot of this avoiding distractions is going to come down to really resetting your boundaries for yourself and for other people about what is going to allow you to be successful in law school and what's not.
Mm-hmm. And I think law school is an interesting time to try and figure out what those boundary needs are, because you're going to need to figure out a whole new set of boundaries when you start working.
Right. And this is all good practice.
Yeah, it's all good practice. And it only gets harder when it's a client or it's your boss pinging you as well, not just the New York Times. So you have to decide what are the boundaries you need to not be completely burned out and strung out all the time. I still remember, to date ourselves, in the age of the BlackBerry. The first weekend I went away when I was working at the firm, and I drove up to Yosemite and my BlackBerry stopped working. And I was like, oh, well, like I was just completely offline. There was nothing I could do about it. But I guess I was just like, I just won't see those notifications this weekend.
No, I remember after I left the firm, I had like phantom BlackBerry syndrome for several days afterwards. I remember being in a car going up to my ski cabin in Tahoe, like right after I left, and literally like reaching for this BlackBerry that was no longer there, like every couple of minutes.
Yeah. It's amazing how ingrained it gets.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The upside is you can work anywhere, but the downside is you can work anywhere.
Right. At any time, I think, is even the bigger deal with work anywhere. And, I think it's important for our listeners to understand that this is something even internally at the Law School Toolbox we talk about a lot. We work in a virtual environment. We have to use these devices to talk to each other. And we encourage our team to set their own kind of like off periods where they don't get notifications and things like that, because it's so easy. We all work on different time zones. I don't want somebody on my team who's working off the East Coast to be pinging me at 5 a.m. and my phone be going off, just because they're working at a reasonable time. 5 a.m. is not a reasonable time for me. So it's just important that you have to be conscious about this. It's something we actually talk about internally a lot.
Yeah. And I think it's something that everyone in today's world really struggles with. So, developing good habits and skills around this will really help you in the end.
Yep. All right. So outside of the digital realm, what about just not being sure what to work on and spending a lot of time worrying about work versus like actually doing work?
Well, I think that's a key distractor for a lot of people. And that one's dangerous because you can sort of feel like, oh, I'm being so diligent. I'm sitting here thinking about, what I should be doing. But if you're not actually doing that work, you're just wasting time.
Yeah.
That's the harsh reality.
Yeah. It's a very thin line, I feel like, between getting yourself organized so you can execute a plan versus just spinning your wheels on a plan. Like, yesterday, I had to have like oh my gosh, I need to create a to-do list because I have way too many things floating around in the air that I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing. But I like created the to-do list, and then I'm like, now it's time to do things on the list. Like, stop making the list. The list is now long. Start crossing things out of it.
Yeah, and we'll have some tips and strategies later for how to deal with this stuff. But I think that's right. I mean, you obviously need to be organized, and that's a really key factor in avoiding a lot of distraction. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, you can't be a total perfectionist about how perfect your organization is if that prevents you from actually doing anything.
Yeah, no, it's so true.
Oh my gosh, I don't have the right color paper to write my to-do list. I don't have the right color pen. Like, I can't possibly do my to-do list. Just like, get a freaking note card.
I know.
Like, use the back of a receipt. Just do it.
But you were the worst about taking notes on any piece of paper. And then I come over to like your place for a meeting, and you're like, I have this index card and this envelope.
Hey, whatever works. Whatever works.
I know.
I mean, although in fairness, what I've done now is I've tried to move all of that into a virtual environment so that I don't lose it.
Yeah, which is better. Yeah,
potentially. All right, so I think those are like two really key areas. I mean, I think realistically, you've got to also consider outside life stuff as being potentially a huge distraction. And, these can be very, talk about relationships. Relationships are wonderful until they're not. Mm-hmm. And let's face it, law school can be pretty hard on certain relationships.
Yeah. Actually, most relationships outside of law school, I think, because oftentimes, you might be negotiating with family about how much time you have to do family things. Romantic relationships can be tough. Even friendships can feel the strain because you may not be as available to folks as you once were, or you might be struggling and not be able to be as supportive to other folks because you're kind of dealing with your own internal stuff.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think any sort of strains that pre-existed law school are just going to get worse, and then probably a lot of other stuff is going to develop. So it's not to say that, you shouldn't have relationships. I think that you should.
They're very important.
Yeah. We're not trying to say like, oh, you can't date anyone, or, you have to stop talking to your family. That's not the situation at all. But you do have to recognize that this is potentially an area that can distract you from things that need to get done, and thinking about how to balance that and what strategies you're going to employ can be very useful.
Yeah, exactly. And then I think there can be issues in the law school environment about boredom, because we'll be honest, some of the work is not exactly riveting.
Right. And I think a lot of times your attempts to avoid being bored can lead to a lot of problems. So it's like, oh, my reading is so tedious, or not even that it's boring, but, maybe you're thinking about it a lot, and, your brain is just spinning. So, I had a friend who later told me that he, every night of his first year, would leave the library and go to a bar for a couple of hours so he could calm down and go to sleep. Mm-hmm. And in retrospect, he's like, that probably was not, being at the bar between midnight and 2 a.m. every night might not have been the best life choice. Like, maybe I should have meditated and tried to go to bed. Mm-hmm. So I think you have to pay attention to how you're coping with these things. And is that becoming more of a distraction than the actual underlying issue itself?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I also think for some students, what can come out in law school are struggles with ADD or ADHD or other learning disabilities. I think we know a lot of students who get diagnosed with these disabilities that maybe they were lurking in the background, but law school is kind of like this pressure cooker that almost amplifies everything. And so if this is something that you struggle with, or you have wondered if you were struggling with, this can make it become a much bigger deal. And so, it's important that if you need to be diagnosed or you need help, that you take the steps to do that, but that it doesn't derail you, and that you just figure out how to make it work for you. It can be a bit of a journey. You have to use a lot of the resources available for you, but you don't want it to become a distraction. You want it to become a learning experience so you can move past it.
No, I think that's right. I mean, I talked to a lot of people who have struggled through a year or two of law school, and in the process of what they're saying, oftentimes you start to see patterns and say, well, has this ever been an issue for you? And they say, well, yeah, I was diagnosed in high school, but I never really did anything about it. And I've always been able to handle it, but now maybe I can't. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a pretty common reaction, just because the stakes are higher, things are more difficult. You're being asked to focus more. Something that was manageable in, a little more easygoing environment is not necessarily going to be manageable now. And that's something to recognize and take seriously.
Right. And to take seriously, hopefully in a productive way, by reaching out to your school's disability services, learning about how to get tested. We have a great podcast episode on accommodations that we'll link to in the show notes, that if this is something you have been chewing on that may be something you're struggling with, I think this episode gives a lot of great insight into why you want to explore testing and accommodations to kind of level the playing field for you. But it isn't something that you want to just be lurking out there throughout the semester. It's something that if you're worried about it, you want to be proactive and, handle it. So if you do need things like accommodations or different study techniques, that you can implement those as soon as possible.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff you can do. So I think just kind of sticking your head in the ground and being like, well, yeah, I'm struggling, but that's just the way it is. That's not the way it has to be.
No, for sure. Now, didn't you just read an interesting book that talked a lot about this stuff?
I did. So in fact, that was one of the ideas for this particular podcast. So I've been reading this book called The Essentialist or Essentialism. We can link to it in the show notes. It's called The Disciplined Pursuit of Less. It's an interesting book. I mean, I'm not sure it's, totally amazing, but it does have some interesting thoughts in it. And the point he makes, which is kind of the basic idea, it's got 3 parts. And I really thought that these applied well to law school and to life. So I'll just go ahead and give them to you. So his first point is about individual choice, which is that we choose how to spend our energy and time. And sometimes in law school, I think it can feel like, oh, I have to do this or I have to do that. And the point of the book is, well, you don't necessarily get to choose what your options are, but you get to choose how you handle them. So, say, for example, you have a legal writing assignment due and you have a midterm exam the same week. Those are going to be in conflict. To a certain extent. So some people would say, oh, I have to spend all of my time doing my legal writing, or I have to spend all my time studying for the midterm, and really take that choice away. But his point is like, you still get to choose. So I thought that was interesting. It was kind of empowering that even if you're in this scenario where a lot is being dictated to you in terms of what classes you take, what professors you have, you still have a choice.
Yeah, that is really interesting.
Second point was about the prevalence of noise in the world in general, or in any sort of discipline. And his point is almost everything is noise, but then a few things are exceptionally valuable. And this is a point that's really similar to what Cal Newport makes in his Deep Work book, which is there's lots and lots and lots of stuff people would have you do or that you might want to do, but only a few of those things are really, really valuable to your outcome. So if you can identify, okay, these are the things that are really going to move the needle when I take a law school exam, you can focus on those things instead of focusing on like all the minutia of everything. And then at the end, you haven't really focused on what is going to make the most difference.
Yeah. What do you think is before you go on though, what do you think is probably the worst of the noise in law school?
I think it's all around class stuff, honestly.
Yeah.
The case reading, rereading cases, doing super long briefs, trying to memorize those briefs, taking copious notes and like spending tons and tons of time like going back over them. Oh, my favorite, when people they record the class and then they want to listen to it again. I mean, if you had an unlimited amount of time, sure, all these things could potentially be useful, but is that really the best use of time? Probably not.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
What do you think?
Yeah, I think I would have to agree. I think I like your point about class prep, because so often people do the most work there because it's like busy work that you can check off your to-do list. Right. And not the deep work that's the more challenging, which is trying to make sense of everything. And so anytime I think that you can just create that to-do list and say, well, I did my 6 hours in the library today, I'm good to go. I definitely agree that that's kind of the worst of the noise, because you feel like you might be doing all this work, but you're not getting much, value output or an ROI or return on investment for the work that you're putting in.
Yeah, and it's not to say that you shouldn't read your cases. I mean, we think you should read them, you should brief them if it seems helpful, but there's a certain point beyond which it really is just busy work, and it's not helpful. Yeah. And finally, so number 3 on the list this is basically what we're talking about, the reality of trade-offs. We can't have it all, and we can't do it all.
Yeah.
And that's just the reality.
Yeah. I tell you, the busier your life gets, I mean, my whole existence is about trade-offs. And I think especially when you think about a legal career and you're trying to balance any sort of, life work with life, this idea of work-life balance, which is something you should start playing with in law school. What is your study time? What is not your study time? What are those trade-offs of those tasks? This is what most people, I think, as we all get older and our lives get a bit more complicated, spend most of our time thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is you just have a limited amount of time in the day, and there's only so much you can get done. And it's really important to focus on what's going to be most helpful to you, what's going to be most enjoyable to you, so that you don't end up kind of down this rabbit hole of distractions and not getting things done. And then that leads to stress, which then means you can't sleep, and then you're even more stressed out, and then you're even less effective. This can get pretty ugly fairly quickly.
Yeah. All right. Well, now that we've convinced everyone that that we all have some challenges in this realm, should we talk about some strategies that they can implement to hopefully fix some of these?
Yeah. So let's try to get practical here, because I think everybody knows that this is going to be an issue. So let's start with our biggest one: internet, phone, social media. I mean, how can we even do this at this point?
It is so hard, and it takes so much self-discipline, but I think you really have to shut it off. I mean, you can have apps that block certain things. I even know that I have found apps that will create quiet hours for your phone. So the only thing that would happen is like your phone could ring, but it won't like allow notifications. It actually won't unlock if you want to go like easily. If you want to go in and try to open it, you have to like bypass things. But there are definitely things that you can do to really shut down the phone use. If turning it off seems too extreme, then I would at least put some restrictions on how it can be used, especially during your daytime, because those distractions are just going to make it harder to do everything else.
Right. I mean, I think you have to almost think of yourself like a monk. If you think of the tradition of legal studies, it was really a person sitting at a desk quietly reading with a bunch of books around them. That's the model. That's basically what you're signing up to do. I mean, I think with a phone, physically put it away. Yep. If you can see it, that's a lot more distracting than if it's actually in a bag.
Yep.
I think obviously if you can turn it off, I mean, heaven forbid if you leave it at home, what's going to happen in the 2 hours that you're studying? Is it really going to be like a life emergency? I mean, people used to function in the world without being able to be available every single second, and it worked out okay.
And I've even had like rules within my family, and this was before text message and things like that, to really date myself. But if somebody called and I didn't pick up, they wouldn't call back. But if it was an emergency, they would call twice. And so 2 calls, one right after another, meant I needed to pick it up. And so you can even come up with these kind of codes for family members. If you have a kid and you are worried that you won't get a call from your caretaker if your phone's in your bag, well, you can always, tell them they need to call back twice immediately, and then you will pick up, something like that. So you can, contain the interruptions. I also know other folks that will just create a schedule for themselves of when they're allowed to check email on their phone. So it's almost like if you know that you have that fix coming, because we're all addicted to it, like your fix is going to come in 2 hours, then, you can do that as well. And then, typically there are very few things in the world that can't wait 2 hours.
Right, absolutely. I mean, clearly, if it's an emergency, you can give people special ringtones and things like that. But that should be a pretty rare occurrence. If you're having an emergency situation every single day with some sort of relationship, well, that's something to address in that relationship, because that's not something that is really going to be good for anyone. I mean, we talked earlier about notifications. Yeah. Personally, I think you should basically turn them off.
Yep.
On almost everything. I mean, maybe not if you're using, WhatsApp or something to communicate with important people. But even then, like, you can just open the app. Like, do they really have to get you that second? That's the whole problem. Like, the problem we're addressing is you have to somehow break that idea in your brain that you have to be reachable every second, because that's just not, your brain can't work and think in the way that it needs to think in law school if that's the case.
Well, even I catch myself with this because you and I use a couple of different ways that we chat with each other throughout the day. And one of them is Slack, which is a common business communication chat room. I don't know how you describe it, but anyway.
Yeah.
But one of the things about that is that's mostly like work related stuff. We use that like instead of email. So I loved the other day, I like see that you'd email me something and I was out in a meeting doing something else. And I had this moment where I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm not going to like get back to Alison. And then I was like, she doesn't care. Like this was still, I like glanced at it. It's non-urgent. You'd like ask me a question that could absolutely wait till I got back to my computer. Like I did not need an immediate response, but if you need an immediate response from me, you and I both, we typically like text each other because we know that will like pop up on our phones. And that's how you and I have a more like immediate dialogue throughout the day. But it's so hard. It's like, I feel like you're doing something naughty by not responding to a message immediately, even though it's completely legitimate.
Well, and also you have to think about, I mean, this is in deep work a lot, where his point is like, if you're a highly paid knowledge worker and your only job that you're actually doing is to field emails because that's what seems urgent, like you look back at the end of the year and like you're going to be in your performance review saying, oh, well, I answered email really quickly. Mm-hmm. Like that's not the point of your job.
Right. And every time I have had a situation where I've been forced to become very efficient about those communications, I find how much faster I can go through it. A lot of people come up with email checking schemes. They check email first thing in the morning and then they come back and they check it a couple hours later and respond to things in bulk and things like that. It is amazing, actually, that the world doesn't end if you don't check email immediately all day.
I know. I mean, when I was on vacation a couple of weeks ago, if it was something super urgent, that needed my attention, I'd come out of my snorkeling and like take a glance at my email and I might respond to one message in a day or two messages in a day. And I probably had thousands of messages when I came back. I'll be perfectly honest. I just didn't look at them.
Yeah. So sorry if you didn't hear back from Alison.
Yeah. But you know what? I haven't actually heard from a single person who was like, I wrote you an important email and you didn't respond to it.
Right.
Not one.
Right.
So it really makes you think like, I didn't actually probably need to look at any of that.
Mm-hmm. Another thing that I have been trying to do to help me manage the amount and volume of the noise in my email is to unsubscribe to lists. Don't unsubscribe to our list. Our list is high value. But, we only send one. And we only send one a week, but I swear every single thing I've ever purchased on the internet has me on some sort of a newsletter, even if I think that I have not signed up for it. And if you go through consistently and unsubscribe, like for a couple of weeks, it's amazing. It can really reduce your junk email load. And that in itself can increase or reduce the distractions in your email.
Right. And I think something for law students to keep in mind is you're going to be on a bunch of lists at school. So, I'm sure like career services will be sending you emails. Your professors might be sending you email. The school in general will be sending you emails. Different clubs will be sending you emails. Make those filters.
Yeah.
Filter those into different inboxes. And then once a day or once every couple of days, you can just go and see, oh, I need to go and pay attention to this. Like they're very rarely urgent, but they will clutter up your life to no end.
Yeah. Linked to what we're discussing here, though, is this idea that, you're not very productive and you're trying to do many things at once. And I think it's the Deep Workbook talks about this, that you really should be trying to do one thing at a time. Single tasking is far more effective than multitasking.
Right. And the reality is it takes your mind a certain amount of time to really focus and go deep. So it's not the sort of thing where you can constantly be coming out of it like every 5 minutes or every 10 minutes. Like you need a couple of hours. And this is why we always say you should block off several hours a week, starting from the beginning of the semester, to do this deep work in chunks, because you have to have, enough time for your brain to really go into something for you to understand it and make sense of it. And if you're multitasking and trying to do 17 things at once, it like your brain just literally doesn't work that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The other options you have are to really just like go on a social media diet or limit your social media use. You can even turn off social media networks if you want. But
you're not really obligated to be on Instagram. Like it's actually totally possible to live your life without it.
Yeah. But you have to ask yourself if they are making you joyful or if they are, really being distracting and holding you back.
Right. And, it's almost like the, what's that woman's name? The sparking joy woman about every possession. It's kind of the same thing with your apps and your social network. If you drop into 10 minutes on Twitter and you find out like, oh my God, the world is ending. I'm so stressed out. This is like, everything is horrible. Oh my God. Maybe not helpful.
Yeah.
For me, like, I really like to look at pretty pictures. So Instagram is like nice and relaxing. So maybe I should spend more time there and less time on Twitter where everyone's arguing about stuff all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so true. What about like your physical space? What thoughts do you have about setting up kind of a physical space where you can be effective?
Well, I think that's huge. I went to architecture school, so I do know something about this, but I do think, there's good research, again, that to train yourself to really be a deeper thinker, it helps to have a place that you always go so that, your stuff is available and you're not looking for Post-it notes or highlighters to get started, and that okay, this is my reading space. This is where I go to read. It's more of a habit. And anytime you can make these sort of things into a habit, I think the easier it is to get started with them, basically, because that's really one of the hardest parts is sitting down, opening up your textbook, putting your phone away, and just committing to reading for 2 hours.
Yeah, it is. It's not easy.
Yeah, but once you do it, you find that like the second hour is usually easier than the first, and then you start to get tired. So, yeah, I think, being deliberate about this, maybe having a place that's not in the law school library. Someone told me a funny story recently who would literally hide out in a library, a different library on campus. And no one, I think he said there were 2 people who knew where he was in case of emergency and knew how to reach him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting.
I think you got to do what you got to do.
Yeah. And you have to I guess you have to really think through what your weaknesses are and what your distractions are, your triggers for distraction to make sure that you're managing them. So for me, if I was at home doing a lot of my studying, I was always distracted by something else to do. Laundry, kitchen, getting a snack, cleaning up something, daydreaming about something else. Like home is just not a place where I could be incredibly productive. And so I just couldn't study there. And once I made that decision, it was a lot easier to study because I just went other places to study.
Yeah, whereas I was almost always like most comfortable studying at home where I had all my stuff and I wasn't going to have people walking past and chatting. So it's totally whatever works for you.
Yeah, exactly. And you have to try different stuff out, especially if you're a new law student. Just be conscious and evaluate how you feel after studying in different environments, or even keep a little bit of a journal so you can go back and evaluate how you felt so you can make better decisions moving forward.
Well, and you can also mix it up. And maybe that certain tasks you're better off doing in one place, certain tasks you're better off doing in other places. There's nothing that says you have to do the same thing day in and day out.
Yeah, that's very, very true. All right. So what about the mental clutter? And this is really all the other stuff in our lives that we try and keep in our brain. What we've talked about in other podcasts is the importance of having some sort of system and plan to organize everything.
Right. I think the system and a plan that you can stick to are really the key here, and being cognizant about offloading information and recording it for later. So, we swear by Trello. We use Trello for everything. Mm-hmm. And I find, so many times, even when we're talking about like, oh, we need to record this podcast, I literally oftentimes can't remember what we decided to do as a topic, but I don't have to. Mm-hmm. And that's the beauty of it. That information is not cluttered. I don't have to try to remember like, oh, this week we're going to talk about this. I just go to Trello and my picture is right on a card that tells me what I'm talking about. And I'm like, oh, great. Okay. We're talking about managing distractions. That's right. We did have a conversation about that. So I think there's so many things to keep track of in law school that getting them down in an organized way so you can forget about them, but still have them when you need them is really key.
Yeah, I think that is true. And of course, we are obsessed with Trello, and it does solve most of our challenges. And I think one of the things I learned was after I had my son and I was exhausted all the time, if I didn't write something down, it was literally gone because I had no capacity to retain information in my brain. It made me really diligent about tracking stuff either in a notebook or in a system where we could share information. And all of a sudden I realized how much better that was than trying to hold it all in your head.
Yeah, I mean, everyone has a limited amount of capacity. And one thing that I do that seems almost silly, but I wake up every morning and when I look at my calendar, if I have something set that's scheduled, a meeting, a call, whatever it is, I literally make an alarm that goes off 10 minutes before that. And I can't tell you how many times these alarms have gone off and I have absolutely no idea what I'm supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
But I know to check my calendar.
Right. Yeah.
And I've given myself enough time to get ready for whatever it is. If I have to go someplace, I might set it 30 minutes early so I can be like, what in the world is that about? Because otherwise I would be worrying the whole day about what time is it? Is it time for my meeting? Am I running late? I just set the alarm and then I forget about it until it goes off.
Yeah. I think, linking to the outside relationship stuff that we've talked about, it's also important to try and schedule away those other life tasks that you can. I think you can use, I could come up with all sorts of different ways to use Trello and due dates and notifications to remind me to do certain things in my life. But I have had some mom friends who've really turned me on to subscribe and save, like on Amazon. So you just decide what things you use on a regular basis, and then they just show up at your house. I'm now really sad when things like the cat food that I buy my cats is not a subscribe and save option. So I have to remind myself to order it on a regular basis because my toothbrush heads just come magically every few months. It's amazing. Now I never run out of toothbrush heads.
High capitalism, really, really amazing.
It is, but it reduces that mental load. I don't kind of track those things in my house. And I think that in law school, or any time that you're functioning on a very high level, these little things that you can do to streamline your life, auto pay your bills and things like that can really save you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these are just not things that you need to be worrying about. You don't need to be worrying about, are we running out of paper towels? Do I have the color highlighter I like? Did I have to pay a fee because I didn't pay my credit card bill? Just at a minimum, set up the minimum payment. If you're not sure if you have enough money to pay all of it, just make sure the minimum amount gets paid.
Right. Exactly.
And for everything, I mean, it's the same thing with your electricity bills and your internet. You shouldn't be spending time paying any of that stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, technology is beautiful in that way. It will just make that all go away. So auto pay is an amazing thing. Your rent, everything. And what about scheduling in breaks? I think one of the things, we're talking about removing all the noise and getting all this deep work done. But don't you think scheduling breaks is almost just as important?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, no one can work, 18 hours a day. I mean, honestly, I don't think most people can even work at a high level for 8 hours a day. And part of this is being realistic. If you expect that you're going to be performing at your top level 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
I was reading an interesting study the other day where they studied top violinists. And of course, the ones who were best, they practiced a little bit more. But one of the things that they did more of was actually sleep and take naps.
Interesting.
And the idea, super interesting. So they were taking naps daily in the afternoon. They'd have a morning practice session, take a nap, and then have another practice session. And the idea was not only were they spending more time, practicing, but they were actually more effective because they took the time to rest.
Yeah. I think that is really interesting. And we've also read some of the studies where they talk about, especially for computer desk work, the importance of taking breaks to clear your mind, to give your eyes a rest, to move your body, and to not sit all of the time, and how that also increases the amount of quality work that you can do. So I know that I have some students who I really recommend work on a 45 minutes on, 15-minute off schedule, because that's how they really need to balance their brain load versus their brain rest. But they will find that they can do many more productive hours in a day if they do that than trying to sit down for 3 hours at a time. It doesn't work.
Right, exactly. And particularly if you use that rest time to get up and walk around outside, take a little walk, that sort of thing. I think it can be a really good way to sort of calibrate the amount of work that you're doing and push yourself a little bit harder without it actually seeming like you're pushing yourself.
Yeah. We talked a little bit about outside relationships earlier in the podcast, but what about setting boundaries with people that you care about or rely on you? What are your tips for that?
Well, I think managing expectations is really the key. I mean, it should probably be obvious if you have a significant other that you may not be able to spend as much time as you have in the past with them, and that's going to be difficult. So I think just addressing that directly and figuring out options, again, like almost habits that can work for you, is probably going to lead to a lot less conflict. So, you know, someone might be okay with you studying late on Thursday night if they know that you've got dinner plans together on Friday.
Right.
That's like, oh, okay, you know, I can make plans with my friends, and then on Friday we'll meet up and we'll have our dinner date. But you've got to be clear about what you need for this experience, and then obviously listen to the other person, what they need, and try to figure out a way to make those things align.
Yeah, I think that that's really true. Communication and setting expectations is just the solution to so many issues around, you know, taking on the undertaking that is law school.
Right. And I mean, honestly, I think if you're in a relationship that's struggling, I think it might be helpful to get counseling. Have a few sessions with an outside counselor who can kind of help you get out of the same arguments that you keep having about you're never there for me. You know, like, okay, that you can only have that argument so many times before it's going nowhere fast.
Right. No, that's a good point. And we can all be better at how we communicate with each other. Like, I don't know anyone who's a perfect communicator.
Right. And a lot of this is skills. You know, a third party might be able to say, okay, look, you know, I hear you say that you want to spend more time together, and I hear you say that you're stressed out about the time that you're not studying. Let's talk about some solutions that might be a middle ground.
Yeah.
Like, you might need that outside perspective.
Yeah, I think that that's a really great recommendation. We also have talked about boredom. You were talking about your friend who found himself drinking too much, but I think there can be other counterproductive habits like watching tons of TV, staying up too late, other types of partying. So how would you recommend to kind of combat this idea that you're maybe on this boredom hamster wheel of law school?
Well, I think a lot of it is just being honest with yourself. You know, if you are like bored out of your mind, maybe you need to find some other way to stay engaged with law or with just life in general. You know, whether it's volunteering for something that you find inherently interesting, or maybe going to an exercise class that's kind of social. You know, looking for ways to stay engaged that don't necessarily involve blackout drinking, which, you know, let's face it, a lot of people have substance abuse problems, and a lot of those start or are exacerbated in law school. And I think that's just something to pay attention to. You know, the culture tends to be pretty heavy partying, pretty heavy drinking. And I think just something, you know, to really not spend too much of your time doing.
Yeah. I think that's true. And I mean, there have been some really disturbing stories. I think in the New York Times had an article about it, about a big firm lawyer who ended up ODing and having a cocaine habit. And I believe he ended up dying. I guess this was a really disturbing article, and I've kind of blocked it out because it was very sad. It was
very sad. It was a really sad article. But yeah, the basic gist is he was a very highly functioning, very messed up person who then did end up dying related to drug use and left behind, kids, wife, the whole thing. It was horrible.
It was horrible. We'll link to it in the comments if you'd like to read it. But probably it is noise that you should not read when you don't want to be distracted, because it's an important read, but take a breath.
And also, in fairness, a lot of the article was about the sort of things that law school can do to people. And there's some studies that are referenced. And I think those studies are worth knowing about, because I think people should understand that you might come into law school being a pretty, high functioning person, but you encounter this environment and it triggers certain things in you. And before you know it, you're kind of going down a pretty bad path. And that's not that unusual. Yeah.
I think that's really true. And then, we talked a bit about like ADD, ADHD, and the importance of kind of taking steps to look out for this, but also to get help. And if you are worried about that, there are so many creative ideas. I really want to make sure that you don't think that this is something that's going to stand in your way of becoming a lawyer. There are lots of amazing law students and lawyers who have found ways to continue to be highly successful even with these diagnoses, but it's all about getting coping mechanisms and learning how your brain works and learning how to work the way you need to.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there are plenty of options you can explore. It's not something that you have to feel embarrassed about or shamed about, that you can't tell anyone, that you can't get help. These are just things, it just happens to be the way that your brain works. There's nothing bad about it.
Mm-hmm.
It's just something that you're going to have to struggle with. I mean, other people struggle with other things. Some people have to sleep 10 hours a night.
Yep.
Just kidding. I don't know. But, people learn differently. And it's just one of those things kind of on the spectrum of ways that you can function in the world that you may have to do a little bit of extra stuff around. But there are lots of opportunities for creative ideas. And law school is a better time to deal with that than when you're studying for the bar exam or when you're trying to work in an office.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think the bottom line is you actually have a lot of control over your time, even if it doesn't feel that way. And you get to decide how to spend that time, even if sometimes it doesn't feel like you get to make that choice either. But it's not easy to avoid distractions and focus, but it's valuable and will serve you well in law school and in your legal career. So, if you are getting ready to start your law school journey, or if you are in law school, it is time to kind of set some intentions to minimize distractions and really be your most productive self.
I think that's right. Absolutely. There are tools you can use. There are books you can read. We'll link to some of those. There are things you can think about. This is all very doable, but it is going to require some self-discipline, which is not necessarily fun, and really some time and effort to think about what's going to work for you and explore options. But it's totally worth it in the end. Like, having a more organized life is probably not going to be a bad thing for you.
I think that we can all agree on that. But with
that, something we all work on.
Yes, like on a daily basis. Well, with that, unfortunately, we are out of time. If you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox Podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on iTunes. We'd really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. Our episodes are typically released on Mondays. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Alison at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or allison@lawschooltoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. We love hearing from listeners, so feel free to drop us a note. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.